He did it again. Toby Fox made an announcement a couple of days ago that the second chapter of Deltarune was about to be released a few days later. He already did the same thing with the first chapter, announcing and releasing a sequel to Undertale suddenly to the surprise of, well, everyone. I will try not to talk about the story or puzzle solutions too much, but I will highlight a few moments that are noteworthy, and I'm going to mention the first chapter as well as Undertale in this video. So if you want to get into this game or these games as uninfluenced as possible, you shouldn't watch this video to the end. In short, these games are wacky JRPGs made by a guy who was influenced by other wacky JRPGs of the 90s, most prominently Earthbound. And it shows in his own games, where character designs are weird but full of expression, and story elements and the whole feel could best be described as, I guess, contemporary. It's full of internet memes and pop culture inspired and often random humor, mostly associated with millennials and zoomers, so the generations that grew up with the internet. And you have to like this style, or you'll be more annoyed by it than anything else. If you like it, you'll find a heartwarming tale in each of those games that doesn't shy away from tackling mature or even disturbing themes, but often enough in a light-hearted manner. So if that's up your alley, just play the games. They're not grindy and they don't overstay their welcome. They look a bit archaic, but that's where the charm comes from when you warm up to this particular style. And they feature some incredible music that's well worth the purchase of each individual soundtrack. Which, incidentally, would really be a nice gesture if you happen to enjoy the music, because Deltarune Chapter 1 and 2 have been and will, for the foreseeable future, stay completely free, so buying the soundtrack is a good way to support the game. That said, let's take a closer look at the second chapter as well as its predecessors to see what it brings to the table. You don't need to have played Undertale to understand the story of Deltarune, but there are a lot of references to the first game as well as, let's call them, recurring characters. Though this game's story is wholly independent from Undertale. And yeah, I'm quite aware that this statement will piss off a lot of the hardcore fans, but I stand by it. Deltarune isn't a different timeline or parallel universe to Undertale, but a completely new story, featuring the same characters. Think of the characters as assets you can pick up and drop into a story. They tend to behave more or less the same every time, but are influenced by the events of the story. That said, it's not that Undertale's characters are prominently featured in Deltarune. They inhabit the town the player character Chris resides in and add a bit of flavor to the world, and sometimes even the main character's backstory. Most of the game, though, doesn't take place in the town, but in the Dark World, a maybe collectively imagined place inhabited by sentient and anthropomorphic personifications of inanimate objects like toys or technical accessories. The first chapter featured characters molded after card and board games, while the second chapter is all about electronics and the internet. You once again have to travel to the Dark World and liberate its inhabitants from a tyrannical ruler and prevent the destruction of both the Dark World and your own world, I guess. I'm not quite sure about that, but I believe it's cleared up in one of the 7 chapters. There are going to be 7 chapters. This is going to be a long game in comparison to Undertale. The first 2 chapters are each about half as long as a standard playthrough of Undertale. Well, I guess the total playtime would be about the same, considering there were 3 different routes to play through Undertale. The neutral self-defense route, the pacifist route and the genocide route, where you went out of your way to kill each and everyone. And you needed to play through every route to get the whole picture. Though, Toby Fox was nice enough to have all the important information you get from the genocide run revealed to you before the actual end of the game. Because He didn't actually want you to destroy his world and kill all the characters you came to know and even like. The game was about empathy and not senseless destruction. So yeah, you were allowed to back out of the evil run while still getting pretty much the whole story. But yeah, you had to play through the game 3 times, and while many of the events changed depending on your playthrough and you got a final act for each of them, most of the areas you had to traverse and enemies you had to face were the same. In Deltarune, each chapter features a different part of the Dark World, with its own enemies as well as friendly NPCs. At least, it seems like it when looking at the first 2 chapters. A huge divergence from Undertale is the game's, but also Toby Fox's persistence that this game offers no choice and will conclude in only one single ending. If that is going to be true remains to be seen, but that is the current state of affairs. The first chapter did have a slight variation during the final boss fight according to your behavior beforehand, but it didn't really change the outcome. You weren't even able to kill anyone in the first chapter. While you could spare enemies just fine, depleting their HP just resulted in them fleeing the battle. That led to a lot of theories about the direction the game will take, with one of the more widespread theories being that while this chapter didn't let you kill anyone, the next would force you to murder every one of your opponents. This didn't happen though. Toby Fox even doubled down on his original vision. You still can't kill your opponents, but with Chapter 2, defeating enemies instead of sparing them has once again consequences. And I believe over the course of the next chapters this will matter more and more, because now you can recruit enemies. After you spared an enemy type enough times, they will appear in your home base in the Dark World. Right now there's not much going on with this feature, but I believe this will become more important in the coming chapters. If you happen to defeat an enemy by depleting their HP, they will be lost and can't be recruited anymore. So now, while this doesn't have an effect on the outcome of the story, you won't be able to get this character to live in Castletown anymore and miss out on some unique lines of dialogue for this and maybe even other NPCs. Not as huge as the 3 different final acts and endings in Undertale, but let's just wait and see how this will turn out once the game is completed. I don't think we will get a chapter where we have to kill all of our opponents. This just doesn't seem to be what Toby Fox wants for his game or his game world. The themes of his work are empathy, forgiveness and redemption, and while he does give players the option to mercilessly slaughter all the characters in the game, it's not to give you a good time, but to have you face the consequences of being a ruthless killer. Even though the game hints at all this taking a darker turn, I believe his core values will shine through in the end. Once again, the game got a bit more complicated, which doesn't mean too much coming from these games. While the first game did have an unique and refreshing approach to JRPG battles and how it affects the world, mechanics-wise it didn't offer that much. Well, part of it at least. Your only active options were to attack and execute a simple QuickTime event, or to act, which meant selecting one command from a very short list of actions tailored to the enemy in question, and you had to guess the right command or combination of commands to pacify the enemy. Its defense mechanic was a bit more complex, with every enemy having a kind of bullet hell minigame where you had to move around an arena and actually dodge the enemy's attacks. Deltarune Chapter 1 already made it more complex by giving you control over a whole party, where each party member had different stats and commands. Some commands used up tension, this game's magic points, which you build up by defending or by grazing, daringly dodging enemy attacks. You could also use Team Attack, which used up all the partaking character's action for this turn and was only available as long as the character was in your party and conscious. The second chapter builds up on these mechanics and gives you even more options and flexibility during combat. The first chapter had only the player character Chris have act commands. The other characters had different spells and were only able to act in a team attack with Chris. This game gave every party member their own act ability that isn't as effective as Chris's, and every character has only one never-changing command per enemy, so Chris is still the most useful character when it comes to appeasing enemies. But now you can still work towards a non-violent resolution even if Chris is incapacitated. You even get access to a new party member, and I guess the roster will grow with every chapter. The recurring characters all retained their development from the first chapter. I mean, I guess this is to be expected, but quite often characters revert back to past behavior in between movies or episodes or games, just to hold on to the drama that worked so well in the past. If this game had been released as a whole, I guess I wouldn't have taken notice, but since it has been 3 years since the first chapter has been released, I kinda treat this as a whole new game. More of a sequel than a continuation of an ongoing project. So it was a nice surprise to see consistent character behavior. The music is once again pretty good, but a few outstanding examples aside, I don't quite like it as much as both the Chapter 1 and the Undertale soundtrack. Graphically, it has the same general style as Fox's previous works, but it gets more refined with each entry. And most importantly, the character and the charm is as strong in this chapter as it was in its predecessors. I'd say there's more of it than in Chapter 1, but not as much as in Undertale. But that might be due to the nature of an episodic game with a lot of small independent game worlds and not one complete, fully planned and executed world. It is an awesome addition to the Undertale universe, and I urge everyone who isn't outright annoyed by the nature of its humor or its look to play it. My recommendation would be to start with Undertale, but there's nothing really wrong with straight up diving into Deltarune if you're so inclined. The first 2 chapters are free, but it seems from chapter 3 onwards the game will cost something, which is still pretty generous. Try it out for yourself and have a great old time with it. And with that, I bid you adieu. That's it from Rady, have a great day, and I hope to see you again on the next game.